MSUM's first student newspaper shut down for swearing and mischief making. As Minnesota State University Moorhead celebrates more than 50 years of The Advocate, a look back at its predecessor that ruffled more than a few feathers. Welcome to this week's episode of Back Then. I'm Tracy Briggs. American student journalists of the late 1960s were an entirely different breed, communicators created from cultural unrest. Surrounded by protests over the Vietnam War, women's rights, and racial unrest, it was probably pretty challenging just to write about who was on the homecoming court. A modern-day pen is mightier than the sword, where journalists challenge the status quo, rocking the boat like a dinghy in a hurricane. And student newspapers in Fargo-Moorhead were right in the eye of the storm. Writer Rob Deckert summed up the new brand of journalism in a 1971 story in The Forum. He says, "Some call it a new awareness. Some call it radicalism. Some call it obnoxious arrogance. It generally means one thing: trouble." Nowhere did this ring more true than on the campus of what is now Minnesota State University Moorhead, where stop the presses almost meant forever. But before we get into all of that, let's go back a few decades to when the paper on the campus of Minnesota State University was born. Back then, way back then, 1924, Minnesota State University Moorhead was known as Minnesota State Teachers College. And they created what would become the only college newspaper that was completely student-written, edited, and printed right on campus. Originally, it was called The Bulletin. It would evolve into the Western Mystic, and later just The Mystic. Now, because this is a podcast, you can't see how we are spelling The Mystic. It is actually a capital M, small I, capital S, capital T, small I, and capital C. Those capital letters are the acronym basically for Minnesota State Teachers College, so you can picture that in your mind. Well, in 1949, the school was marking its 25th anniversary of the publication, and it had a big spread in the Forum. Lots of pictures of the young students working and very complimentary articles about the groundbreaking work these young student journalists were doing. But that was 1949. Just 20 years later, the celebrations at now what had become Moorhead State College had turned into conflict. During his first address to students in the fall of 1968, new president Roland Dill criticized the Mystic for inaccurate reporting and the use of four-letter words. The comments came after the paper put the blame on Dill for the school not rehiring a popular humanities professor who had been pretty active in military draft counseling, and of course that was a little controversial at the time. But Dill had said the decision not to rehire this professor was based upon academic credentials. But the situation escalated even more in 1969 when the Mystic chose to publish excerpts from two articles that had been banned for publication in a college literary journal. President Dill called it mischief making to publish them in the paper. He particularly objected to one of the four-letter words used, slang for a part of the female anatomy. There were also other words and expressions not usually seen in newspapers. So, on May 2nd, Dill suspended the newspaper until he said, quote, "My confidence can be restored in it," end quote. In the following days, some students wore white armbands in protest of Dill's action and blue armbands in support of starting some kind of independent paper free of the administration's control. 1 week later, the staff of The Mystic published The Mystic. And again, because this is a podcast and you can't see it written out, the new paper was spelled MYSTIC, so didn't really have anything to do with the initials of the college itself. So the Mystic, the new Mystic, was a paper by students, for students, paid for without college funds. It was operated on a shoestring budget out of a garage, as the paper was no longer able to operate on campus or use campus facilities. For his part, President Dill applauded the effort and said giving sole control of the paper to the students would be a great learning experience. The new publication received some help from fellow student journalists at the University of North Dakota. The Dakota student editor and later long-term columnist at the Grand Forks Herald, Chuck Haga, gave one page of the UND school paper to the staff of the Mystic to tell their side of the story. And that issue of the Dakota Student from UND was then also distributed on the MSC campus. The Mystic started out pretty strong, but eventually it just wasn't able to attract as many advertisers as it needed or sell as many copies as they would have liked. The paper folded. Two other independent papers, the Moorhead Independent News and the tri-college venture The Paper, also folded, but the presses would soon start up again at MSC. In September of 1971, for the first time in more than 2 years, Moorhead State College published an on-campus student-subsidized newspaper with Volume 1, Number 1 of The Advocate. The paper was a cooperative experiment by the Student Senate, college administration, and the Mass Communications Department. So they were giving it another shot with a student newspaper right there on campus, produced on campus. Those involved said they were going into the idea of the new paper and thinking that, yes, it would be permanent, but they were very much doing it on a trial basis. President Dill told the students that he wanted the paper to serve both faculty and students and be more than just a bulletin board. He said there would be opinions, but he said probably 2 or 3 shades less than before. Dr. Charles E.P. Simmons, the administration's representative on the creation of the paper, said the survival of the Advocate was based on one thing. The students must like the paper, he said. So as former staffers gather this weekend to remember the creation of the Advocate after years of chaos, it's pretty clear the experiment worked. After more than 50 years and countless lessons learned, the Advocate appears to be doing something right. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at how student papers at North Dakota State University and Concordia College were actually fighting their own battles over drugs, sex, and censorship at this very same time. Thanks for listening to Back Then. Hope you join us again next week.
Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inform.com. Visit Inform.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.